Welcome to Fringe Pop 321, the show that believes the world is stranger than we think, but thinking should not be strange. We are back again with Dr. Aaron Judkins and Dr. Judd Burton talking about Göbekli Tepe. And we've talked about sort of a basic introduction to the site, and we got into sort of the religious impulse that might be, a good candidate for why the site is even there and what motivated its use. And at the end of that, you sort of made a few comments about how this might fit into biblical primeval history, biblical prehistory, which sounds like a misnomer because the Bible is a written document. Prehistory is, of course, before writing. But the Bible has its own story about things that happened in very, very early times, and that's what we're talking about here. And every culture really does, especially in the ancient Near East. There were certain supernatural, impetus points or forces or factors, intelligent agents in the supernatural world that are linked invariably, in various civilizations to what we think of as the rise of human civilization, some of the transitions. So I'm assuming that's where we're going to go in this segment. So how does this relate to Göbekli Tepe?
Well, I think you've got a similar set of occurrences at Göbekli Tepe as you would have in the narrative that's in something like Enoch. You've got this, for
the viewers that may not know Enoch, you should just trace that a little bit.
Yeah, well, in Enoch, which is a piece of apocryphal literature, which ostensibly existed in oral form for, however long before it was written down. It's part of an explication of this biblical prehistory that we're talking about, specifically the event of the Watchers and the Nephilim in the pre-flood world. And we get a sort of timeline, at least in terms of the pre-flood patriarchs in the days of Jared. It's when all this happens. You've got the 200 Watcher angels, the fallen angels that land on Mount Hermon and begin the so-called Genesis 6 experiment.
Yeah, I like to say, because Enoch is an apocalyptic text, so it's not just you're all doomed to get ready.
Yeah.
but he wants to throw in, here's why you're doomed. In other words, why did humanity become so corrupt? What happened? So that's where he takes us back into all this stuff.
Sure, and even this combination of practical sciences and occult knowledge that the Watchers convey to humanity in the Enoch episode, the Genesis episode, completely changes the culture at that point as well. And that, as Aaron and I have been researching this and sort of backtracking the physical evidence and some of the conclusions of the archaeologists is looking at the implications for this supernatural intervention, because as we said, religion is the catalyst for this site.
Yeah.
And
you would think if this is what's in their heads, there would be some indication of it.
Yes,
at the site.
And for millennia, depending on what chronology people, I realize that there are going to be young Earth and old Earth people who are watching. But the sequencing, the deposition is going to be the same regardless. But, ostensibly for millennia, if we're using conventional dating, perhaps even, hundreds of thousands, millions of years, humans have been hunter-gatherers and horticulturalists. And in the span of geologic time, if you're looking at it in these big epochs of time, there's this small window in the Mesolithic and the Neolithic where humanity now has these new social options. In other words, the city-state dwelling. It's not like all humanity becomes, farmers overnight, because a lot of human societies remain hunter-gatherers and horticulturalists or of one sort or another. But you now have this new drastic cultural change, this new alternative for organizing people socially that exist. And in terms of geologic time, that's overnight. And that's why I like to call it this 90-degree angle cultural change. And if you,
It
you know,
seems abrupt. Is the point,
it's
yeah.
abrupt, yeah.
It's very abrupt. Hence the term Neolithic Revolution, because the revolution was, there was an explosion of knowledge in advanced mathematics and the sciences, in megalithic architecture.
Yeah,
There's
that's the way we would tell by the architecture.
yeah. There's no, in other words, there's no periods of cultural evolution happening here. Cultural evolution. It's change is not linear. Change happens. It overlaps time periods. It overlaps distances. It overlaps even technology. It's not a linear change at all. This happens. Sometimes it's it web and flows. It advances. It recedes. But in this case, there's an explosion of knowledge, and hence the megalithic architecture we're seeing at Göbekli Tepe.
There's going to be some catalyst to this.
Yeah, and
Either some personal crisis or cultural crisis or some. I mean, there's some event.
Well, the event I think that really catapulted this is the Noahic deluge, and so what I discuss in the book is the possibility that this is a post-flood site, still related to the Watchers and the influence of the Watchers. But
it sounds very Mesopotamian, actually. And again, we've got the Hurrian. You mentioned the Hurrians later. I mean, those threads bleed into this, and of course, they intersect with biblical stuff. Because in Mesopotamia, it was the Apkallu. Okay, they're the ones. They're the great civilizers before the flood and after the flood. They're who they were, according to what the text described, is different. Before their flood, they're 100% divine. After the flood, well, they're of human descent. That's what the tablets actually say. But the flood is in Mesopotamia. It's the same thing. There's this before and after, and you have this notion of a supernatural influence on either side.
I think the flood resets everything. It changes everything, and the people who come off the ark are basically, I think, the generations after at some point, but they're reset back to the Stone Age, if you will.
Yeah, they got to start over.
They got to start over, and so what do? Well, you pull your resources together. You have the people, and if you're a stone guy, then you're out there working on stone. Those stones that were quarried are limestone, and it's about a quarter of a mile away from the actual site. Some of them are between 10 and up to 50 tons. So this is very heavy, but they're actually pulling this off with an incredible skill, if you will. It's really a surprise to the archaeologist that such capability could even happen back at this point in time. But
do you think it's because of certain assumptions still? I mean, even among professionals about the intellectual capacities of these people.
Right, and we're not taking human effort and ingenuity out of the equation. Personally, I think that the workforce was human, but that still doesn't explain necessarily the explosion of knowledge that had to take place.
I mean, if a Mesopotamian was sitting here, you'd say, well, yeah, we built that, but we learned this or that. We learned how to do it over here. They're still going to credit, the gods, or in this case, the Apkallu specifically, with not just this body of knowledge, but all sorts of things.
Yeah, and I think you've got an analogous situation at Göbekli Tepe. I still think, and I know that Aaron does too, that the point of origin for this knowledge was the Watchers. And there are a number of reasons that we can get into in a moment, for why they would have even cared about a location like Göbekli Tepe.
For our viewers, I can't take for granted either that when I mentioned the Apkallu, one of the again they were good guys, okay, because they help us have civilization. They're wonderful, okay, and so they would they would make figurines of Apkallu and put them in building, you know, perimeters and stuff like this to ward away the bad spirits, you know. And in Akkadian, the term for those figures is matsare, which means watchers. I mean, it's an exact linguistic equivalent.
Absolutely.
So, you know, we can talk about Mesopotamia, and again, the Hurrians have, you know, similar ideas and all this, and it does bleed you know, into this. You know, a term like watchers, people think of Enoch, and then they think of Genesis 6, so they think it's a biblical thing only. That's not actually the case.
No, and
in this part of the world, that is not the case.
As has been demonstrated, there are other, you know, cognates and shared ideas between words within that toolkit, if you will, like Rephaim, you know, with Mesopotamian and Phoenician material. But again, you know, one of the things that we've tried to emphasize is just the drastic change that's taking place here. And one of the things that occurred to me anthropologically, and this is something that authors like Jared Diamond of Guns, Germs, and Steel fame and Thomas Sowell have talked about within the political, social, and economic sphere, is that if you look at the impact that certain human societies have on other human societies, in other words, ones that have more sophisticated technology, and for whatever reason they're militarily or politically superior, the kinds of changes that they exert on other societies when they come in contact with them are often irreversible and not infrequently to the detriment of those cultures that they're impacting. And so I began to wonder about the possibilities of taking, for instance, by analogy, the example that Diamond used in his book of the contact between the Old World and the New World, the Spanish, in particular the Spanish and the Inca, because it was all of these very distant causes that had to do with geography, epidemiology, the spread of agriculture and metallurgy in Eurasia, which is long east to west. And so it was easy for these kinds of things to travel, you know, on those latitude lines to different parts of Eurasia. And so geography sort of played a role in that superiority, that political, military, technological superiority. There were herd animals in the Old World, bovine, you know, cows that we were exposed to, or our ancestors were exposed to, that sort of, you know, not completely, but sort of inoculate us against things like anthrax and smallpox, and so we became less susceptible to those things. And so you've got an epidemiological facet there as well. And so you combine all of these things that happened thousands of years before the Spanish ever come in contact with the Inca. Well, the Americas are long geographically north to south, so it was harder for that information to traverse all of those biospheres. They had no herd animals, and so there was no immunity to the diseases that were brought over. So you had this sort of unconscious biological warfare going on, plus the superior, you know, technology, the steel, the gun part, you know, in the title, Guns, Germs, and Steel. You got gunpowder.
Even short of, you know, something that, you know, as modern as guns, let's just put it that way. You can see the contrast.
Exactly, and so although there were all of these causes that were set up, distal causes, if you will, that were set up long before they even came in contact with one another, had nothing to do with, you know, one was less human than the other, or one was braver than the other, or whatever. It's they were so far ahead that the changes that were going to be wrought against the Inca were irreversible, and they were negative, as they were for many peoples in the Americas. And I think you see something very similar. The only kind of changes that really, to my mind, that can take place to this extent in prehistory have to have this sort of outside influence. Again, it doesn't take away, independent invention and tinkering and the kinds of things that we talked about in the last episode. But it seems to me if you're going to look at this through the biblical lens, then the watchers have to be that influence, that outside influence. Because certainly we see that taking place in the apocryphal material. The impact that it has on humanity is detrimental. There are wars that break out in the pre-flood world. The resources of humanity are consumed, humans themselves.
Yeah, for viewers to whom, again, a lot of this literature would not be familiar, Enoch is the consistent touch point. And there would be some listening or watching that would say, well, that's not, in the Bible, it's not biblical material. Well, that's true, but there are other places in the Bible that repurpose not only Enoch, but books like Enoch. And scholars, come up with the brilliant adjective Enochian material. Things like the Book of Jubilees, for instance. So there, Book of the Giants at Qumran. This is all Enochian material because it covers certain themes and, stories, and there's a lot of overlap with the Book of Enoch. And so biblical writers, again, in my own material, I pointed this out. Like in Reversing Hermon, I have an appendix there. There's like over 100 places in the New Testament where something in the Second Temple period is repurposed. Okay, so they were very familiar with the material, and they didn't, they didn't adopt it all, but they didn't reject it either.
Sure.
I mean, they're interacting with it on a pretty regular basis.
Yeah.
And so, since that's the case, this does become, in some sense, a biblical issue.
Yeah.
Because of the sort of the stance of the biblical writers toward the material and toward the ideas. And if you get into those books, there are all sorts of other stories that would be in the primeval period that, yes, you're correct, they're not in the Bible, but they're in this other source material that biblical writers were quite familiar with, and interacted with positively in many cases. So that's essentially, the angle that you're asking viewers and readers ultimately of your book, to at least put this idea on the table that there may be some cross-fertilization here going on, different versions of the same story, but it has a biblical, it does have an attachment to biblical prehistory.
I think it gets back again to the axis mundi, if you will, of this lost connection between heaven and earth and the people. And we certainly see an outside influence of the watchers, but deities in that region. We talked about the ancient god Nanar earlier, but it's interesting to note that in their archaeological record at Göbekli Tepe, I think there are 3 deities represented. That's on the eastern pillar 18 and western pillar 31. Those 2 central pillars, and I think enclosure D, these deities, one is...
well, don't identify them yet, because this is actually, actually a good transition point, because when we come back, I want you to get into that, and also some very specific iconographic depictions, pictures, sculptures, etchings, iconography is kind of a $64 word, but that's what we're talking about here. So we want to talk about a few specifics when we come back, and get into what deities we might be talking about.
Sure.
All right. Well, thank you once again for watching Fringe Pop 321. Please visit our site and watch all of our other videos, and don't forget about our website where you can get more information. Every episode that you'll watch here on Fringe Pop has a corresponding web page with resources and data and lots of other discussions. So go to fp321.com for more information, because what you know may not be so.